introduction, although that's actually really hard for me on this topic because it's something I'm very passionate about. I'll start with a personal story. About 4 years ago, before the holidays, I started to notice just declining health. I was getting into my 40s. I looked at the scale one morning. I realized I had gained basically 2 pounds a year since I graduated college. I was having knee pain. I didn't feel that I was thinking as clearly as I knew that I had in my past. I didn't feel sharp. Jamie. Yeah. Well, and I remember it was actually Christmas morning that I basically decided, okay, well, and of course after the holidays, we all sort of struggled. I said, okay, I've got to do something about this. And I had avoided, personally, I really kind of hated the field of nutrition because I found it very frustrating as a field of research because, you'd see the popular information come out and say, well, margarine is good, margarine is bad, do this. Now, no, that's bad for you. Sorry, we messed up. So I just was sort of frustrated and had the attitude, well, when you guys figure it out and tell me what is right to do, I'll be ready to do that. And of course, like everybody in here, I was very busy with work and family and all the different obligations I had. So, I just ate whatever was there and available, tried to make the best decisions I could, but it didn't have me in a good place. So I really started at that point. I said, okay, I've got to do something about this. I started at that point to really begin to try to educate myself about nutrition for my own purpose, to try to get in better shape, to lose weight, to hopefully improve what was kind of going on with I had some knee pain and brain fog and whatnot. And as I read and I found a sort of a program that worked for me, which basically boils down to, eating natural foods, more or less. And there's a little bit more to it than that. But it's a whole lot of common sense and a whole lot that goes against sort of what we've been conditioned and trained to think about food that we'll hear more about today. But what I also began to understand as I read more and more on the topic is that what we eat also affects our mental health. And, and I experienced significant improvement in my own cognition, my own mood, as I changed my diet, which wasn't really the reason that I was even starting it. And as I began to look at it, there's emerging evidence, there's still a lot of work to be done, that what we eat has a significant role in our mental health. And I began to connect that to my work. My passion about really changing the lives of people who are facing mental illness. And when you begin to look at the diets that many of the people we serve eat, and the way they think about nutrition, even the way we think about nutrition in our setting, we don't ask questions about it. We don't incorporate it into our treatment in any significant way. I think this is something really, personally, I think this is something really important. I honestly believe, and we shall see, that this will be a topic that in 10 years we'll all look back on and say, how did we miss this for so long? It was so obvious that what we take into our body, we understand that it affects, all of these physical diseases that we have, the diabetes, the cardiovascular disease, the other chronic disease. Why did we never connect it to mental health? So we shall see if that's the story. I think there's a lot of work yet to be done, a lot of research, a lot of learning, but we've been really thinking about this in our environment and beginning to really develop. It's hard to find, frankly, people doing clinical work and research in this area. There's not a lot of good work going on, not a lot of money in it, frankly, and sort of, people eating the right food, but we reached out to Dr. Drew Ramsey, who is our speaker today, who is an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at Columbia, and affectionately known as the Kale Doctor, and he'll talk about that today. But he's really done some of the best work I've seen, particularly on educating the public about the importance of diet and nutrition to brain health. You know, he is the author of the Happiest diet. It's a nutritional prescription for sharp brain, balanced mood, and lean, energized body. And also, more recently, a cookbook called 50 Shades of Kale, which I highly recommend. Very exciting, April says. So Dr. Ramsey, Drew will address these questions about nutrition today and talk to us about the connection between nutrition, the microbiome, and mental health. He's a psychiatrist, an author, and a farmer. He has a farm in Indiana. He knows Denny Morrison, too. And he's one of psychiatry's leading proponents of using dietary change to help balance moods, sharpen brain function, and improve mental health. The Food and the Brain workshop he chairs at the American Psychiatric Association annual conference has educated hundreds of psychiatrists on the potential of nutritional interventions in clinical practice. And his work and writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Huffington Post, NPR, The Atlantic, The Doctor's Show, and CBS News. He is also promoting National Kale Day, and I got this wonderful shirt today. I'm sure we can make them available to you all one way or another. But anyway, with that, I guess let me just welcome you, Drew. I'm so glad you're here, flew down today to be with us and really share with us how you begin to incorporate nutrition into your work with patients.
Awesome. Thank you, Doub. It's great to be here. I get to look at the room. Hi, everyone. Well, I just flew down from New York. It's wonderful to be here with you all, although I'm sorry it's so cold. I was so surprised. So we're going to talk about food in the brain today, and because I think Tom's experience is what a lot of us have had. Just somehow we don't quite connect that this organ, which actually uses more of your food, 20% of your basal metabolic rate, just feeds your brain. Right? So more of your food goes to your brain than any other part of your body, but we don't often consider the implications of what we eat on our mental health. Although we all know that basic rule, right? When you eat well, you feel a little better. When you eat poorly, you don't. So now this is a clinical case from my office, actually. It was just a couple days ago. A patient came in, severe phenol retentive disorder. I thought probably partially obsessive, corn-pulsive, partially aggressive, sociopathic, occasionally homicidal. I put her into a Gordian analysis to try and get underneath sort of the penis envy that I was sure she had and to work out her edamame complex. After a long treatment, though, I've decided she's probably bipolar, garlic depressive. All joking aside, my disclosures, I'm big into kale. If there were a kale lobby, I guess we'd be it. I'm the co-founder of National Kale Day, whose mission is to promote kale. So we'll be talking about kale, and I'm kind of biased. I like kale. I do some consulting for even hotels, but I will not discuss any off-label medications. I will be discussing kale. And then I have 2 books out now, so you should be cautious because people who write diet books, they're questionable. And I'm a true believer at this point that we really can move the dial on people's mental health by intervening and helping them eat better. When we think about the brain, as we were just discussing, we kind of think about it in isolation, even though now in the age of neuroplasticity, we know that the brain exists in an environment, right? And our genes are expressed in reaction to that environment. And so today we're going to talk about what is a brain food. What are the foods that actually feed the brain? We're going to look at that through a lens of neuroplasticity, because that's different, right? When I went to medical school, we did not know the human brain continued to grow, but now we do. And that actually gives us a powerful motivation, I would say, to do something, especially, I hope you'll feel motivated when you see some of the data connecting food to neuroplasticity. We're going to talk about dietary patterns, which the basic take-home point there is it's not just about kale. It's not one superfood that's going to save our collective health. It's shifting our overall dietary pattern. We're going to look at how food has changed and a couple of examples that I think are quite stark in terms of the last 100 years and what we as humans did to food. That we've changed food, and some of the health consequences we had, I'm already seeing some nods, you know this, right? We're not eating the food that probably our genes grew up or evolved eating. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the patient assessment that I do in my office. I'm a practicing clinician. I was seeing patients yesterday. I see patients all the time. That's what I like to do. That's why I became a psychiatrist. And over the last 4 or 5 years, I realized I didn't really have a tool. I could tell people to eat more kale, but I knew that wasn't really going to help. And so I've developed something called the brain food prescription, which we're now manualizing and hoping to pilot early next year. The basics of the brain food prescription is to help patients choose these top foods that support their nutritional health. So that's our agenda for the day. It's a little bit bold. I'm going to be flying through a lot of slides. We'll have some questions at the end, but I'm hoping to show you sort of some of the data, some of what I do, and then let's have a dialogue about it. So this is the promise, right? If we eat this stuff, right, we eat lots of fatty fish with omega-3 fats and fruits and vegetables. We eat some lentils with lots of folate and the occasional dark chocolate. Dark chocolate, the flavanols were just shown to reverse aging, memory-related aging in people in their 60s, studied by a colleague at Columbia, Scott Small. Really one of the first studies that's ever been shown to have that effect on mild cognitive impairment is the molecules that are in chocolate. So if we eat these foods, do we have a stronger, more resilient brain? That we all know the road of life has lots of bumps, right? So part of what we're looking for is resiliency and risk of illness. And when we think about what's for dinner, then we can kind of look through a few lenses. One, we can just look at nutrients and mechanisms, and we like this because it's concrete. We know what B12 does in the body, and you don't have B12. We can kind of begin to understand some aspects of that illness. We're going to look at epidemiological studies and what they say about diet. And then we're not going to talk much about this, but there's another piece that's very important, especially when it comes to patients, which is looking for foods that are sustainable and feasible, i.e., if goji berries are the secret to brain health, that's not very practical for us because I don't know how to grow goji berries. I'm not sure where to find them, and I don't know how to eat them regularly. So we're looking for solutions that are good for our patients, good for the planet, and practical. I'm a Indiana farm boy. Like, if it's not practical, I'm not very interested. When you ask people about their diet, most people strangely say, I try and eat a pretty healthy diet. Right? I count calories. I try not to eat too many of those. I don't eat cholesterol. I try to avoid fat. Everyone's very proud. They don't eat red meat. And then people, especially in New York, look at me with a little wink and say, yeah, but I drink a lot of red wine. That's great for me, doc. And so that's the healthy diet. And it's interesting. We have all kinds of diets in healthcare. We have diets for diabetes and diets for heart disease. We have diets for cancer, but we don't have a diet for the brain, which is kind of strange, especially when you think about all the disability data that we have coming out, right, that tells us brain disorders take more healthy years than just about anything from people. So what happens if we put the brain right at the center of how you make your food decisions? Your brain consumes, as I said, 20%, about 420 calories per day, 60% of all the glucose you eat, 20% of your calories. Your brain is mainly fat. Now, this always surprises patients because they've been busy trying not to eat fat. Well, your brain's made of fat, and actually your brain is the largest deposit of cholesterol that you have. It's not in your arteries. It's in your brain, absolutely essential molecule for cholesterol. There would be none of us if it were not for cholesterol. You also have a very high concentration of polyunsaturated fatty acids, which is the fancy way to say omega-3 fats. And what's all that energy for? Well, these are very, very hungry, very busy cells, our neurons, right? Every neuron reaches out. We have 100 billion of them. They reach out and connect to thousands of other neurons. They're always firing, right? Your brain does not rest. Right? Later on tonight, I'll go to sleep, and my legs will rest, and my bones will rest, but not my brain. Our brains keep working through the night. And part of supplying all this energy means that we have a choice, right? Because the brain needs more than just calories. You then need all of the nutrients to deal with those calories, to process them. So just a quick example to start us off on the potential power of food. This is not one of my patients, but a patient of a colleague, a man in his late 60s who was having pretty significant memory impairment. And he, in discussion with a colleague, they were talking about changing his food, and they put him on what's called a ketogenic diet. This is a diet where the brain switches over, and most of you might know it as the Atkins diet. The brain switches over, and instead of being fed primarily with blood sugar, glucose, it begins to be fed primarily with ketones, which are the breakdown products of fat. So it's a very high-fat diet. So this is a man who's in bad shape. You can see the clock test. Those of you who are clinicians, right? He's trying to draw a clock here. He's trying to draw some intersecting triangles here. He was supposed to write a sentence, and he really struggled. All he could write is Judy, which is his wife, I love you. This is 2 months later. You can see there's a complete clock. You can see there's intersecting triangles, and this is a nice long sentence, loving sentence that he writes about his wife. No changes in meds, just changes in what he fed his brain. The neurologist said he'd never ever seen anything like this, right? So I'm not recommending we all go on ketogenic diets, but this is just a concrete example that that intervention was just about changing food, just changed what he ate, and this individual had a remarkable response. When we think about changing brains, right, we're in mental health, we often think about meds. That's usually what we lead with, and I prescribe a lot of medications. That's certainly an important part of what we do. But in addition to our pharmacy, where our medications live, I'd argue that there's another pharmacy, the farm pharmacy, right, where we have food. And when we begin to think about food as medicine, it becomes a very powerful intervention for our patients because unlike psychiatric drugs, we know patients eat usually at least 3 times a day. They're already eating. So it's already behavior they engage in. They're already shopping for food or getting it from somewhere. We can shift that behavior much more easily than we can have them adapt new behaviors. And we can see that something's happening in America, some good news, right? There are now 8,144 what I would call pharmacies in America, which is one of my favorite interventions with patients, even in New York City, which is to help them go to farmers markets. Because farmers markets mainly have whole foods. Farmers markets often are a great deal. A lot of states have 2-for-1 food stamp dollars. So you can go and buy all kinds of wonderful, healthy, fresh produce at a farmer's market, support your local farmer, engage in a community, get to know people a little bit. I love the farmer's markets in New York. It's actually been one of the things that's really fueled my interest in food professionally. With a nice farmer's market that was right by my house in downtown New York. I grew up on a farm, and I found there I am living in the biggest urban area around, and I'm eating more farm fresh food than I ever had. And so it's kind of an exciting little turning point that's happened. So let's talk about nutrients. We have this concept called nutritionism, which we're going to take food, and we're going to right now we're going to break food down into nutrients. By the end of this talk, I hope you don't think about nutrients. I hope you just think about foods, because people don't eat vitamin B12. They eat clams, right? People don't eat DHA. They eat wild salmon. And so the hope of all of my work is to create food recommendations, not nutrient recommendations, but those food recommendations are based in the nutrients that we understand the brain needs. And just as one other note, there's more to food than nutrients, as you guys all know, right? I'm sitting on the back porch with my daughter. We're hanging out, we're laughing, we're giggling, we're playing with these muscles, sort of excited that her palate is developing. There's a whole kind of stress-reducing thing that's happening that's much more than just B12 and omega-3 fats, although I'm happy we're getting those. Now, why do we like nutritionism? Well, because as scientists, we like knowing what things do. So we know B12 plays an essential role in the brain. It's kind of a central gear. You need vitamin B12 to lay down the myelin that insulates all of your neurons. You need vitamin B12 to make all of your monoamine neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. You need vitamin B12 to reduce homocysteine. There are links to every psychiatric illness you can imagine with vitamin B12. And we know that a lot of people are quite low. Your top food sources are not the kind of things that usually people pitch to eat, right? Seafood, grass-fed beef, particularly liver, yogurt, cheese, and eggs. In general, those are the things we're told not to eat, right? Well, this very essential brain nutrient is only found in those foods. It's also the biggest vitamin we eat. It's an absolutely huge molecule. And this is where B12 lives in the brain. This is the methylation cycle. The money is down here, right? Serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. And right here, glutathione, which is the top innate antioxidant in your brain. It's the one that you make. So if we don't have enough B12, our homocysteine goes up. We don't do as good of a job making L-methylfolate, which gets into the brain. And as you can see, all kinds of B vitamins in this cycle. Vitamin B3, vitamin B12, vitamin B6, and this is folate, which is vitamin B9. So the idea is that if we are low in B12, we can't complete these essential functions for a healthy brain. And that then gives us a list of kind of the top brain food nutrients that we'd look for, right? And probably familiar to all of you, right? Omega-3 fats, folates, vitamin B9, fiber, because we now know of this huge connection between our gut health and our brain health. Vitamin B12 we've covered. Vitamin D, where we all know we're all deficient. But I'm sure those of you who are clinicians have seen many patients who get better when they replete their vitamin D stores. Vitamin B1, needed for every energetic reaction in your body. And so we come up with kind of a nice list of nutrients, and then we want to translate that into food. Right? So anybody here would sometimes kind of want to live like on a smarter planet, Like if there was an option like this planet or one that's a little smarter, like, I don't know, some days I'd like to live on the smarter planet. Well, if you wanted a smarter planet, actually, it's feasible. There are 2 billion people on planet Earth who are iron deficient. And researchers estimate that if everybody on planet Earth got enough iron, our global IQ would go up by 13 points. We would have a 13% smarter planet. And so how could we achieve that? Well, we could achieve that with some clams, right? This is for 100 grams, which is not a lot of clams. It's like a nice little dish of pasta vongole. We could achieve this with, anybody have any idea what this is? Well, it's some beef, it's a liver right there. So lots and lots of iron in liver, right? Anyone know what this is? Oh, this is fruit of the gods. These are pepitas, pumpkin seeds. That is dark chocolate, even dark chocolate, right? So 97%, what's that? The fruit is the cacao, which makes chocolate. So, oh, I'm so sorry. That's a cashew. It's a cashew fruit. That's where cashew nuts come from. So again, a variety of foods that provide iron that aren't exactly on the top of most people's lists, particularly liver. But things like clams, pumpkin seeds, cashews, and even dark chocolate are ways that you can give your brain iron. When we think about brain food, I have a basic set of rules about food. I'm not a big rule guy, but this is the rule of kale. So I got obsessed with kale, and what kale has taught me is there are 3 fundamental rules that a healthy brain food has. One, it has nutrient density. That's bang for buck, right? So a soda is 140 calories, 0 nutrients your brain needs, just glucose, right? Glucose and fructose. A small kale salad, let's say 3 or 4 cups of kale, right? A little bit of olive oil. That's about 140 calories. In that, you're going to have over 3,000% of your daily vitamin K. You're going to have 800% of your daily vitamin A. You're going to have over 500% of your vitamin C. Not to mention getting towards probably about 30 to 40% of your needs of folate, manganese, magnesium, right? The list goes on and on and on. Plus, you get all these phytonutrients, these things we call antioxidants. They're not really antioxidants. They're molecules that interact with our genes that generally do good things. You're going to get all of that for 140 calories. So that's nutrient density. You want the kale salad and not the soda because you get more bang for your buck. Then there's culinary versatility. I got kale sitting in my crisper, and boy, I can do all kinds of things with it. I can make a smoothie in the morning. I can put it in my eggs. I can have a kale salad for lunch. I can do a saute. I can make a kale chip. I can do lots of fun things with kale. It's like a good basic food, and lots of foods have great culinary versatility because they're simple, what I call one-ingredient food, right? You look at kale. What are the ingredients? Just kale, apple, clams, right? Not a big ingredient list. And then the third is local availability, because I have a belief that if we're going to have a strong country and strong communities, we have to have local food, because it not only builds the kind of structures we were talking about earlier in terms of the relationships people build, but it also just reduces cost, right? If I buy kale from my local farmer, I'm keeping those food dollars local. So now we're going to crank through about 15 slides that tell you the data around how dietary patterns are related to mental health outcomes and mental health. So first, there was a review of the observational studies. This really depressed me. This was in 2010. They found 34 publications. They looked at all of them, and they're looking at sort of single food groups or nutrients as related to things like depression. And what they found mainly was this. If you look at the results, it's just a lot of zeros. There are some findings for fish oil and B vitamins, but there's not a lot of positive data. And that's because we don't eat single nutrients. You can't eat fiber in the natural world without getting some phytonutrients. Just nothing out there in the natural world. It's hard to eat fiber without getting some vitamin C. So people started beginning to look at dietary pattern. And dietary pattern says, let's look at your whole diet kind of in a more of a gestalt way. This is Felice Jack is one of the leaders in this field. She did a cross-sectional study looking at 1,000 women, mean age of 55, assessed them in the ways that we'd want her to, food frequency questionnaires, a SCID, and found that there were these kind of 3 patterns. There's a traditional diet, vegetables, fruit, the food that your grandmother ate. There's a Western diet, processed meat and chips and white bread and beer. And then there was a modern diet. And here's what our data looks like. And so the significance was with the traditional diet. So as we get lower than 1, there's a decreased risk. So about a 35% risk reduction of the traditional diet in either having depression or anxiety. Again, just cross-sectional data, but an interesting data signal. The data then gets better. This is a prospective trial. This is the largest trial of food and mental health. I'm sure a lot of you saw the study, The Mediterranean Diet Helps Prevent Heart Disease, that came out earlier in the year, I think in February. So this is the same data set. This is 10,000 healthy participants. They were followed for 4.5 years, and they were assessed in their Mediterranean dietary pattern. Sort of looked at the diet and said, okay, you eat the Mediterranean diet or not? What they found is a potential significant role in preventing depression. And just a reminder, Mediterranean diet, right? Whole foods, foods with one ingredient, fruits, nuts, some meat and dairy, some fish, but it's a plant-based diet for the most part. So here's her data. Now, just to orient you to this, 6 to 9, these people are really eating the Mediterranean diet, right? And these folks are not. And just the thing to see, these models are different statistical models that they ran through with different co-founders, but you just see this nice trend for every model, right? That as people eat the Mediterranean diet, fewer people get depressed. And it's significant. I like to think about it, one, I like that this 5 group is sort of the winner, meaning like you can eat close to the Mediterranean diet and still have a pretty good benefit. And for those of you as clinicians, this is the difference in my mind right here, right? So people pretty much eating the Mediterranean diet, 32 folks present with depression, and when you're not, 67 folks do. So just imagine, that's the difference between 1 day of work and 2 days of work, right? So again, really this is the first signal we found in mental health that says, this can actually prevent depression potentially. The data continues. Because this is mainly data that comes from surveys, I like to go British because I think those British civil servant workers who fill out these questionnaires, I think that they fill out questionnaires very, very accurately. Maybe that's just my fantasy about the Brits. But they completed surveys and had multiple evaluations, again, looking at a dietary pattern of whole food versus processed food, and it's what we would think. The whole food pattern shows a reduction of about 30 to 35% in the risk of getting depressed, and the processed food increases your risk by up to 80% in this model. And then here's a study of adolescents, right? Lots of concerns about adolescents and mental health. This is dividing diet into quintiles of healthiness. And the basic point is, compared with people who really eat a healthy diet to people who don't, there's about a 79% increased risk of getting depression. Same number exists for ADHD. So there's some signal that we're getting consistently. Then I just wanted to throw this study in because a lot of you work with disadvantaged population, that it's also just not the nutrients, it's also about what's called food security. That I know I'm going to go home tonight, and I'll get home late, and I know my wife will make me a nice dinner, right? A lot of people don't know that. They don't know where their food's coming from. They can't afford healthy food. They're nervous about food. It's called food insecurity. Food insecure adolescents, 5 times more likely to have attempted suicide, right? 4 times more likely to have dysthymia. When we go to the elderly, community dwelling elderly who have food insecurity have a 10 times increased risk of depression. So again, just an intervention that potentially can help is making sure that your elderly patients have food security, even without changing what they eat, by helping them access food pantries, food stamps, eating in groups. So what are the mechanisms potentially behind this? Well, one is just frank nutrient deficiencies. That in America, we see actually a fair number of dietary insufficiency, like 97% of Americans do not eat the daily recommended amount of vitamin E. Vitamin E is a fat-soluble nutrient. Low levels of vitamin E are correlated with increased risk of depression. We talked about B12. So just the way that not eating enough of the nutrient, your brain doesn't work as well and increases your risk of illness. We have this notion of neuroplasticity and BDNF. There are now 5 things in food that are clearly shown to affect production and levels of BDNF. And they are zinc, omega-3 fats, magnesium, curcumin and curry, and the flavanols that are found in things like chocolates and onions and plants. There's a whole theory of inflammation is when you're low on these nutrients or when you're eating a diet that's quote-unquote pro-inflammatory. There are a lot of ideas behind that, and certainly inflammatory markers are linked to depression. There's the idea of visceral fat, that as we've eaten more fructose, adipose tissue isn't just that we don't look good in our bathing suits. Fat tissues are metabolically active tissues. They're constantly producing signals that are reasonably inflammatory. So sort of a link between these two things. Another mechanism potentially is that people just aren't eating a lot of plants, and so they're not getting a lot of these phytonutrients that are also quite both anti-inflammatory but do interesting things, like one in kale and lots of other plants, sulforaphane, increases your liver's detoxification, sort of ramps up those pathways that detoxify things. So sort of I say kale's the real detox diet. You just become a better detoxifier. We mentioned the microbiome just a little bit. Again, the idea of eating plants, just one meal changes the sort of gut bacteria. And so if you're eating a diet that has a lot of plants in it, you've got different bugs living in your gut than if you eat a diet with a lot of salami in it. And we know that the microbiome, and we're going to learn more and more about this, has powerful influences on how we feel. And then there are just toxic diet effects, that we've put stuff in our diet. And I'll tell you a couple of my favorite stories. But trans fats, that's a new addition to our diet, thanks to Procter & Gamble in 1912. Food dyes, those are new. In our country, unlike other countries, we do lots of coal tar-based food dyes. So it's very interesting. And M&M here has a coal tar-based food dye in it. All of them do. Many of those are linked to cancer. In the European Union, they force producers to use natural-based food dyes. It's sort of a simple switch there. And then I think there's a little bit of a toxic effect of, we have people who are malnourished, eating foods that aren't good for them, living on the white carb diet. There's also that increased risk of a medication load. That if you come to me and you're depressed and you're well-nourished, hey, I'm going to do some psychotherapy, give you Zoloft, get you to exercise, right? But if you come to me and you're doing very poorly because your diet is poor, you're now going to get the risk of these medications, which, you could sort of argue maybe if you were better nourished, you might not need. I just want to tell you about a couple of those mechanisms in a little more detail. The first is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This is kind of not the newest news, but it's sort of the neurohormone that is underneath neuroplasticity. It coaxes new brain cells to be born in the hippocampus. It keeps brain cells alive when we stress them, and it's all over the brain. BDNF you find lower levels in depressed patients and schizophrenics and people with Alzheimer's disease. In our animal models, when we downregulate BDNF, the mice look anxious and depressed. There's a polymorphism of the BDNF gene, this Val66 MET. When you have that, you have an increased risk of depression. You also have some interesting things like more driving accidents, so just an idea that the brain might not be kind of learning as quickly. And then there's an association with the severity of Alzheimer's. Still an emerging story, but interesting, especially when we see that BDNF gets affected by what we eat. Now, this is not the strongest data, but when we feed rats a high sugar diet, we get less mRNA, less hippocampal BDNF. And that's the diet that most Americans eat. When we look at the overall and aggregate our diet, the majority of calories for the average American come from added sugars and added fats, right? So very few nutrients for the brain in that. The Western diet, I don't know what they were feeding the rats, but whatever a rat Western diet is, impairs hippocampal neurogenesis. And then when we feed it to people, BDNF goes down within 6 hours of a high-fat meal. So again, just a notion that, boy, what you eat does affect this very, very important hormone in your brain. And then this is my favorite study that's come out in a long time. This is the only study that looks at BDNF levels in humans and dietary patterns. So this is that same Sun Navarro data set. And what they found is the Mediterranean diet augmented with nuts, not with olive oil. This VOO is olive oil. But with nuts, you have a 78% reduction in the risk of having severely low BDNF. Right? So again, just one study, nothing conclusive, but very interesting that there's something in nuts that separates out. So what really emerges in this data is a story of two diets, right? We have a whole diet of foods that we all know and recognize that have one name, like almonds and kale and clams. And then we have, our processed food diet, which has a lot of white carb, a lot of omega-6 fats in the forms of vegetable oils, a lot of additives, preservatives, dyes, man-made stuff. And really, does anybody think that this is what our brain should run on? It will. I mean, that's a fascinating thing. It will run on that stuff. But that's probably not, certainly not what it was designed to run on, as none of these foods really used to exist. So quickly, let's talk about some of the dietary changes that have happened over the last 100 years, just to maybe put that in a little bit of context. I'll tell you a couple of my favorite historical stories. So we switched from whole foods to processed foods, and it's predicted that within the next 15 years, 80% of what we consume will be prepared by somebody else. And that doesn't mean like your spouse in the kitchen. That means, Whole Foods or a food delivery service, or hopefully for you it does mean your spouse in the kitchen. But we now eat more processed foods, right? We've increased our intake of sugar and refined carbohydrates. In my mind, you should not separate out sugar and refined carbs. There are some slight differences, but they're all simple sugars rapidly absorbed into the bloodstream, be it glucose, which raises your insulin level, or fructose, which actually is what's called glycolating, meaning it gloms onto proteins and And fructose can only really be turned into triglycerides. Unlike glucose, which feeds your whole body, fructose really only goes to your liver where it's turned into fat. We switched from animal to vegetable fats, right? That's what people cite as really being important for heart disease. I'm not so clear about that anymore. And we've changed the ratio of these two very important long-chain fats, omega-6s and omega-3s. We used to, for every one omega-3 fat, we ate 2 to 3 to 4 omega-6 fats. Now, for most Americans, it's more like 1 to 20. So the idea then is you have a cellular membrane that has more omega-6 fats in it. Omega-6 fats are kind of like the SWAT team of our body, very inflammatory fats. They're very important if you have something happen to you. But I kind of think about if you eat a lot of omega-6 fats, it's kind of like your neuronal membrane is a little bit ready to fire. It's like somebody in a real irritable, bad mood. It's like ready to have an inflammatory reaction. Whereas the omega-3s, they're like more like traffic cops. They're like, let's all get along. You've got the green light. Like they're anti-inflammatory. Then, as I said, we've added these new molecules: food dyes, preservatives, trans fats, stuff that we just, there's not definitive data. We just don't really know what some of these things do. But at least the data on things like trans fats, boy, they don't do anything good, and we certainly don't need them. So let's talk about Christopher Columbus. This is more than 100 years ago. Now, everybody like Italian food? We all love Italian food. So it's sort of fascinating to think that 400 years ago, if you went for Italian food, there'd be no tomatoes, because there were no tomatoes in Italy until Christopher Columbus brought them back. The other thing he brought back was corn. Actually, when he got back to Italy, he presented to his mistress a corn flour. That was like the big present he was bringing her from the New World. So Christopher Columbus came back with corn. And boy, corn was very popular. Very easy to grow, very inexpensive, very delicious, and it became a staple throughout Northern Europe and Romania and Hungary. Right about the time, 1600, there started being like these rumors. These like very strange people that wouldn't come out during the day because the sun hurt their skin. They're very aggressive, and they'd attack you, and some people would see them eating bugs, and they even rumored they'd drink blood. And soon became the legend of the vampire. There's a vampire right here. Now, this is a gentleman who's suffering from the condition of pellagra, which is vitamin B3 deficiency. He doesn't come out during the day, not because he is the undead, it's because he has dermatitis that's so bad his skin gets thick, which is what pellagra means. He is demented because he's been missing this essential vitamin B3. Remember, that was in that sort of attached to the glutathione pathway. So he's not making enough innate antioxidant in his brain. He has horrible diarrhea, so he doesn't like to leave the house very much, and he's irritable all the time, and eventually he dies. Christopher Columbus, when he brought back the corn, he forgot to talk to the people who'd been eating corn their whole lives. And societies that subsist on corn always soak it overnight with lime, and lime releases the vitamin B3. So it's, I think, a good historical example of, we come up with a lot of explanations, right, about how this man is a vampire, when actually he's just vitamin B3 deficient. Another way our diet has changed is these omega-3 fats that everyone has heard about. Now, there are 3 omega-3 fats that you should be concerned about. There are about 6, but when we talk about plants, all plants have ALA, which is, except for algae, which is the shortest. In our bodies, we take ALA, we turn it into EPA, and then DHA. DHA is the only omega-3 that gets transported into the brain. You have to eat it. You can make some of it, but in general, we're pretty inefficient at making omega-3 fats. Omega-6s and omega-3s, again, both essential, but they compete for these enzymes. So as we increase our omega-6 intake, we're kind of taking, the theory is we're taking some of these enzymes, and we're even less efficient at producing omega-3 fats. So what do? Well, we started eating a lot of omega-6 fats. If you think about the main fats that most of us eat, they're these polyunsaturated fats, these omega-6 fats that, again, in general, people say, oh, they're healthy, they're good for you. Well, they're also way out of balance. Remember, we were talking about like 1 to 1, 1 to 2 is the ratio we're looking for. So corn oil, 1 to 40. Sunflower oil, 1 to 39. Right? So these are these are the major fats now in Americans' diet. Again, something that's very new. We've never ever before had fats like this. And it's cholesterol-free, thank goodness, right? So, but that's actually where this kind of came from, right? The whole idea is that heart disease was caused by saturated fat and cholesterol, and we were going to get rid of those things by eating things like margarine, which was about 50% trans fats. And speaking of trans fats, there's another linkage, right? Trans fats increase the risk of getting depressed by about 42% in 12,000 university graduates who are followed for 6 years. Now, that might be because trans fats are really, the bad ones are only found in processed foods. If you stop eating food from a package, you will not consume any unhealthy trans fats ever again. Trans fats, now, even though they're banned by Mayor Bloomberg in New York, they still make up 2.5% of total caloric intake in the U.S. So people are still eating a lot of trans fats. The way you avoid them is don't eat packaged foods or anything that says hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, anything like that, avoid. So trans fats are horrible for you, right? They kill, they're estimated something like 200,000 heart attacks a year due to trans fats. Anybody know where they come from? See, I didn't know either, and I got really curious. Boy, these toxic fats, like where are they from? Where do we find them? Well, we made them in the laboratory. Two brothers, Procter & Gamble. They'd only made soap and candles out of pork lard. So it was kind of ambitious, but they had a lot of cottonseed oil left over because they'd started using that to make their candles. And because of that, there was a German biochemist who had figured out if you heat up cottonseed oil, you sprinkle a little metal catalyst, you bubble hydrogen through it, you know what? It comes out and it looks like lard. And they said, boy, this is pretty cool. Maybe we should have people eat this. So they then launched the largest ever marketing campaign that changed how Americans eat. 1912, they roll out Crisco. They had what's that? It was lard in a can, but it was better than lard, right? It was digestible. They had physicians give testimonials. They sent out groups of young women who had a special Crisco cookbook. And this is 1912, right? We just found out penicillin. 1912 also, the other thing that happened, we discovered the first vitamin. So we don't know anything about nutrition at this point. This gets rolled out as really the savior of our health. You can see all these American, right? The way you make a real shortcake, a real American shortcake is with Crisco. And we incorporate this into our diets. Right? And what happens? Well, industrial trans fats, they're not like anything else that we eat. They're not even like the trans fats that you find in things like grass-fed milk or grass-fed beef. They have this kind of, they're all trans. I kind of think about them, they're like grit in our biochemical gears. Our body just doesn't really know what to do with them. We don't know exactly how they cause illness, but they certainly cause a lot of inflammation. So the basic lesson is, we started messing with Mother Nature's beautiful design, and we made some significant missteps. All right, now I do have a, what? Oh, is this a quiz? This is just a, so 1992, this is before we started getting rid of trans fats. You want to guess what percentage of fats in breast milk were trans fats? No guesses? It's sort of a random, obscure question, right? 7.2%. So again, this is a completely new fat. We've never eaten it, and now it's kind of everywhere. All to say, these three examples, we changed our food, right? We then changed what our brain is being fed, and the consequences so far have not been very good of most of those interventions. So let's talk about the brain food prescription. Now, this is sort of what's developed in my practice over the years of how I assess people and how I talk to them about food, and we'll go through some of the ideas behind it, and then I hope to just walk you through the major categories of food and how I talk with patients. The strategies for changing food, one is to lead by example. That I think that clinicians need to be interested in food a little bit, like Tom is interested in food. When he talks with a patient about the power of food, he's got a personal narrative, and I'm going to believe him more. I'm going to be inspired, maybe. I'm going to see it can work. The goal is behavioral change. As we know, words kind of aren't enough, right? We have to be really engaged with patients to get them to change their behaviors. We need to help do things like teach them about shopping and cooking and preparation. We need programs that focus on food, and there are lots of fun people that you can partner with in your communities who get very excited and very interested about this. Chefs, nutritionists, health coaches, trainers, and that sort of team of people, I hope, is what we'll begin to develop as we think about intervening with food. It's great for group interventions because people love to get together and eat and love to get together and cook. And then there are all these wonderful ways that it kind of, as mental health professionals, opens up to us, right? Where suddenly we have a place in farmers markets. We have a conversation to have with farmers, right? We can partner with them and get farm fresh food into our mental health clinics. A lot of places are doing this. This is Eskenazi Hospital in Indianapolis. Now, this is actually now completed. This is the mock-up, the animation. I've actually eaten kale from this field. This is on top of the roof. They have a garden. They have bees. They grew so much kale this year that the food service didn't know what to do with it. And this is in their first year. So they're growing produce on the roof of the hospital, using that to feed patients, and also then using that as a green space to educate patients about nutrition. I think we're going to see more of this. This is the Henry Ford Health System. They were taken over by, or their CEO is a VP from Marriott, so very interested in hospitality. They now have a teaching kitchen, a greenhouse, and they're, again, growing food, teaching about food, doing kitchen demonstrations. So when we think about this, this, in my mind, is now a mental health intervention. Getting a group of people together, having that nice group effect of sharing in something healthy and cooking healthy food. The other thing that I sort of rely on is thinking about food and dietary change from the stance of motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing being a philosophy of meeting patients where they are and helping coax them to that next stage of change. Right? So it's easier to get somebody to quit smoking once they have lung cancer, right? But before they have that lung cancer, how do you motivate them? Well, you assess where they are. Are you thinking about quitting smoking? No, not at all. So you haven't thought about it? That's strange. Well, I'm thinking about it. Oh, I just got you to contemplation. Really, what are you thinking about quitting smoking? Well, sometimes on my birthday, I think I'm going to get lung cancer. Oh, wow. What kind of plans have you made? So now we're preparing, right? Well, maybe we'll give you a little Wellbutrin to decrease the craving, or some Nicorette gun, get a stop date, right? Now we're into action and trying to get you to quit smoking. So the same thing happens with food. And most people already are at contemplation, somewhere in between contemplation and preparation. If they're not eating healthy, they know they should and they want to. Right? And so then we get into helping them prepare. So it's going beyond saying, as I remember I was in the OBGYN office with my wife when she was pregnant with our first kid. And we're going to the door, and we're all got our hand on the door handle, and the OBGYN said, "Oh, and keep eating healthy." Well, I'm glad that she mentioned that. I'm glad that she mentioned eating healthy, but that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? So I do a very simple food assessment, and you all are food experts, in my opinion, that I think most people know what is a healthy meal and what isn't. And I do this by taking a very simple dietary history where I'm not interested in exactly how many milligrams of this and that. I'm interested in the broad brushstroke of what your dietary pattern looks like. I ask people to keep a 1-week food log, which really now is developed into just a 3-day food log, because that's all I need to see some very clear patterns and help get you motivated to change. And I look for what's missing, and it's almost always the same thing. What's missing is seafood, oftentimes green. Another way to say that is colors and real food. And then I always take a really unbiased approach. I don't care if you're paleo or vegan or you're on Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig. That's your choice. My job as a clinician is to help you make better choices within that dietary plan. So my simple food assessment is say, hey, I'd like to talk about what you eat, because that's really important in terms of your mental health. And I say, tell me what your typical breakfast, lunch, and dinner is. And then I take notes and I get real curious. What's in the coffee? What type of breakfast cereal? Where do you get the eggs? I ask about snacks. I ask about people's favorite foods. So do you have any problem foods? Do you have any allergies? Do you have things you hate, things you love, things you binge on? Do you have restrictions? And again, I'm looking for these high-yield foods to intervene that I know in general people aren't eating seafood, people are eating bad quality meat, and people have bad quality high carbohydrate snacks. Then I look for brain food swaps, right? How do I take something that's unhealthy and give you something that's healthy? So one of my favorites is I have a vegan patient who doesn't eat any meat, doesn't like fish at all, but she's from Belgium. I said, well, what about mussels? She says, oh, I love mussels. Are those good for me? I say, oh, you never have to eat fish or worry about that ever in your life, because mussels have everything that fish has, probably more of it. They're really inexpensive. They're really easy to prepare. They're available everywhere. Instead of $20 a pound, they're $4 a pound. Right? So we just solved her potential B12 problem, giving her lots of iodine, lots of vitamin D, all kinds of nutrients for her brain. And here are some other brain food swaps. This is probably my favorite. I was talking to a reporter, and she said, I love white chocolate pretzels. Now, white chocolate has none of the good stuff from chocolate in it. It just has sugar on top of a pretzel, which is just glucose, right? Nothing good for your brain. So, well, do you like almonds? She said, yeah, I like almonds. Like, do you like chocolate? Yeah, I like chocolate. All right. So now we go from white carb to 2 of the healthiest foods you can eat for your brain, dark chocolate and an almond. Still got a crunch, still a nice treat, costs a little bit more than a white chocolate pretzel, but you could say that you're dosing yourself with a brain medicine as opposed to giving yourself a high-carb snack that's going to put you to sleep. Kale chips for potato chips, beef stew for a hamburger, a blueberry almond yogurt smoothie instead of cold cereal. It's all about increasing the nutrient density with a simple swap, and then giving something specific that a patient likes. Right? If someone says, oh, yuck, kale chips, all right, fine. We're not going to talk about kale chips. we'll find something else. But the hope is to make a diet based on the foods that people like, that they already eat. Here's one of my patients, and this is her 3-day food log. So just look through here with me, right? So we get some white carb with some bad meat, right, and some coffee. And as you look through, some things are missing. Anybody see, like, some things that are missing? Yeah, there's no vegetables, right? Show me color. It's like there's no color anywhere. Like tomato on the sandwich is the closest to Caesar salad. Right, so this is 3 days, and she's eaten vegetables twice. And she's eaten no seafood, no nuts. Right? This is a very healthy, smart, lovely young woman with severe anxiety and depression. So we just talked about it. Said, hey, you don't eat any seafood in your diet. You don't eat any vegetables in your diet. This is what she looked like afterwards, right? So now we get some eggs with some tomatoes. We got a banana in here, an apple. Got some curried tuna salad, a curry and tuna. That's great. Spicy salmon. Are these all of my favorite choices? Like, no. There's that Diet Coke and Diet Snapple, but that's fine. She likes that. I'm not going to go after that. First, I'm going to increase the nutrient density of her diet, which she's able to do simply by drawing some attention to it and setting some clear goals. More leafy greens, more seafood. This is my favorite way to assess diet, which is I ask people to take pictures of everything they eat, which is really easy now because people already take pictures of everything they eat. So this has really gotten much easier. So this is a young man who was having a hard time gaining weight, had a severe depression, wasn't eating very much, loved to cook. And I knew that was going to be a great asset to him if we could help motivate him. Now look at what he's eating, right? The white carb in the bad meat, right? If we look through here, we just see basically white carbs, mediocre quality meat. I think the pork is actually a very healthy meat for the most part. But mainly white carbohydrates, the only color you see are these sour gummy candies. And, he does get some points for the freeze-dried, the astronaut bar ice cream sandwich. But again, lots of processed foods, lots of fake nutrients, no seafood, no leafy greens. So I don't have the follow-up slide on him, but he started drinking more smoothies because he didn't have a lot of appetite. So I could get 800 calories into him in the morning with a kind of blueberry, kale, yogurt. He'd put a little thing of protein powder in there, put it down the hatch. 800 calories of all kinds of good stuff going into him as opposed to this breakfast where he just gets glucose. He started doing those shakes and then started every evening he would cook a nice piece of some meat or chicken and then a bunch of vegetables and a little bit of a whole grain. And that sort of became his ritual with his family. He started cooking for his family, had all kinds of mood benefits, right? He felt more just sort of competent and capable. He felt like his parents respected him more because he was cooking for himself. He felt this efficacy of self-care, right? He's just taking better care of himself. I like to give patients something, and so this is my brain food prescription. It looks, this isn't the color version, but it looks just like kind of has the same background as a medication prescription, with the idea that I want people to go through here and circle a couple of things that they like, because I want to give you a diet based on the foods that you tell me you like. So where there's no disagreement, I'm not even pushing you to eat stuff that you might not like. And these foods then become the foundation of the next couple of weeks, with the notion of, okay, I don't see any seafood in your diet. Do you like any of these? Oh, yeah. I really like oysters. Are those good for me? Oh, yeah. You should eat oysters. Eat like a dozen a couple times a month. That's great for you. Right? How about meat? Oh, I hate meat. Meat's not good for me. I'm really against factory farming. Well, what about some local grass-fed beef from your local beef farmer? Well, that sounds interesting. So you sort of find some common ground and help people create a list of foods, all the while, as I go through, and do some education around what you get from seafood, why nuts might be important, why you should use spices like curry. And then I modified it where now the seafood's on top as opposed to the meat, because realistically, people eat plenty of meat. It's about making it better meat. So I just want to go through these categories with you, just sort of like I do with a patient. So we eat seafood and recommend seafood because of omega-3 fats and B12, vitamin D, zinc, iodine, right? Absolutely key for thyroid functioning. and chromium, which helps your body process glucose. We used to eat all kinds of seafood in America, right? When Hudson first sailed into New York Harbor, there were huge oysters the size of dinner plates, and New York has been a sort of center of oyster culture. There used to be piles and piles and piles of them. And it just begs the question, how many, and this is a quiz question with the present. You will win a copy of 50 Shades, you will a National Kale Day t-shirt. If you can, first person to tell me how many calories are in 6 oysters. 210, I hear? I heard a 10. 150? Just throw out a number. 60. Who had said 60? You win a National Kale Day t-shirt. 57 calories in an oyster. This is a nice National Kale Day. National Kale Day is the first Wednesday in October. It's a day when we try and get people to eat kale. If you eat kale, happy National Kale Day. If you eat kale, you are celebrating National Kale Day, and we have I'll show you the website later. So 57, right? So that's nutrient density. Now, just quickly, why do we care about things like bivalves, oysters, mussels, clams, and small fish? Well, just quickly from an evolutionary perspective, right? We got bigger, and our brains actually got much bigger, right? And then our brains got a little bit smaller and much more efficient and much smarter. Now, if we look at where the human brain evolved in the Rift Valley, right? There's like thousands and thousands of years ago. We think about it as a grassland. But that doesn't make sense, because anytime animals move into a grassland and become pure herbivores, their bodies get bigger and their brains get smaller, like a rhinoceros. Now, we don't want to become like rhinoceroses. We have big brains. And so if evolutionary anthropologists have gone back and sort of looked at this area and said, this wasn't a grassland back then. This was the coastline. And they find these sort of ancient archaeological sites with these giant, what are called middens, these big deposits of clam shells and mussel shells and fish bones that ancient peoples were eating. If you think about the nutrients that we really need to make our brain function, omega-3 fats, zinc, these sort of minerals that are a little hard to find in vegetables, they all exist in small fish and the bivalves. We've talked a little bit about omega-3s, and the other thing you get from oysters, you get a good dose of omega-3s. I'll show you those numbers in a second, but there are just 3 ways that omega-3s influence the brain. One is that you get into this membrane, and those sodium-potassium channels are a little more efficient. Things like your serotonin receptors just function a little, quote-unquote, better. Omega-3 fats travel into the nucleus and increase expression of BDNF. And then omega-3 fats, when you have more of them, those synaptic vesicles that kind of get launched across the synapse, they also function a little bit better. This just reminds you there's a lot of different types of seafood, right? It's hard to find somebody won't eat a crab cake, right? Or, a little oyster stew. Crab, by the way, is the top source of tryptophan, which we need to make serotonin. And in terms of nutrient density, right, so this is 6 mussels, 146 calories. Look at these numbers. 736 milligrams of DHA. Look at your fish oil pill when you go home. It'll probably have about 100, 150. Usually that's in 2 pills. So to get the amount of 5 or 6 mussels, you're going to have to eat, 5 or 6 fish oil pills. But in the mussels, you're going to get 1/3 of your iron in a highly absorbable form called heme iron. You're going to get all of your selenium needs, and you're going to get 340% of your daily vitamin B12. Now, if you've sat down to eat mussels, you all know you don't eat 6 of them. You eat like 40 of them, right? So you are mega dosing on vitamin B12, which you store in your liver. You have about 3 to 5 years of B12 in your liver. So again, good example of nutrient density, right? Not the best culinary versatility, but pretty good. You can do all kinds of interesting things with mussels. And one of the reasons that it's really sort of a top recommendation I have. People, when you talk about seafood, they worry about mercury. I always like talking to pregnant women. It's like you say fish, they say mercury. You say, oh, seafood, they say mercury. It's like a call and response. You cannot worry about mercury by eating small fish, right? Because mercury accumulates over time. So there's a difference between a piece of tuna and an anchovy. Anchovy's not going to have any mercury in it that you need to worry about. And then, of course, you can, if you want to eat bigger fish, which everybody enjoys eating bigger fish, you can go to the Monterey Aquarium, has a great kind of fish buyer's guide. This is all saying, eat small fish. Sardines actually end up being one of the top dietary sources of calcium because you eat those little tiny bones. All right, so next category are leafy greens. We eat leafy greens because they have lots of vitamin B9, folate. They also have lots of fiber, of course. We get a tremendous amount of vitamin K, absolutely essential for GABA production. And also, again, those fat-soluble vitamins, K, A, D, and E, are all very important. Again, going back to the idea that the brain is fat-soluble, right? So nutrients that dissolve in our brain fat are going to do a better job protecting us. Leafy greens like kale, which are low in what are called oxalates, actually have more absorbable calcium in them than milk. So it's very interesting. We hear, got milk, but really it should be got kale. And then phytonutrients, we talk about this cruciferous family. All right, we're going to finish up. This is for the book. What percentage of vitamin A, daily vitamin A, is found in just 1 cup of raw kale? I heard it. Did someone get close to 200? Something like that? You win a book. All right. This book's yours. We'll sign it when we're done. Here's the numbers on kale, and this is the lesson of kale, right? Rule of kale is nutrient density, and this is so 33 calories. Look at what you get here, right? Just incredible amount of nutrients, vitamins, and this doesn't even have the phytonutrients, which are like, there's a phytonutrient in kale. You all heard of resveratrol in red wine. Everyone's like, oh, resveratrol. The company that isolated resveratrol and made a supplement out of it, they sold to GlaxoSmithKline for $750 million because it's supposed to prolong life, right? Those trials have not turned out so well for anybody. But camphorol, which is in kale, does the same thing. It's like resveratrol's cousin. Looks like it extends life of cells. So kale, again, another way of saying it, very nutrient dense, 33 calories, right? You get some of those shorter chain omega-3 fats, lots of vitamin A, K, C. So it's an interesting question. Some nutrients are heat labile, like folate is always going to decrease by 1/3 to 50% when you heat it up. Some phytonutrients are a little heat sensitive. Minerals become more absorbable. So one of the things that cooking does to our food is it makes most food more digestible. And then you also, there's some concern about kale that is not based in any science that kale can interfere with the thyroid, which there's no data to back that up. But you decrease some of those molecules that are called goitrogens. They compete with iodine for uptake into the thyroid. So it's where I sort of say people should eat kale all kinds of different ways. But for the most part, most of the nutrients stay when you cook kale. This is one of the largest kale fields in America. This is if you've eaten Cal Organic kale, that's where it came from. A sea of kale. And you can do all kinds of things with kale. Again, that culinary versatility. These are kale chips. Super easy to make. Take 10 minutes. Kids love them. Sort of easy snack. So again, those cruciferous vegetables, dark leafy greens with some spice in them. Some people find them very bitter no matter what you do with them. They're super tasters, but usually if you saute it with some onions, those people will eat them. And again, these flavonoids, these are really very, very cool molecules. There are thousands of them. They're in all fruits and vegetables. These ones in citrus bind to our opioid receptors. Quercetin is a sort of amazing kind of antioxidant. There's camphorol, which I was telling you about, like resveratrol. So all very interesting molecules, and I think an emerging story, especially when we think about how some of these interact with our microbiome, because many of these are antiviral and antibacterial. So it's sort of, if you think about kind of a selection of the bugs in your gut, one of the ways that you really can shape that is by eating more plants. And then just the mechanistic effects, some flavonoids increase BDNF, right? That neurohormone that promotes sort of brain health and brain growth. We talk a lot about what we eat. We forget to ask patients what they drink, and patients mainly drink soda, not mainly, but often, right? And there are obviously healthy alternatives where what are we doing with these alternatives? We're increasing nutrient density. Along with the calories, you're going to get all kinds of interesting things. But that's not what most people are drinking. They're drinking the soda, right? Sugar consumption in America, we were at about 5 pounds per person per year. For the whole year, 5 pounds of sugar. When King George III sent his folks over to the Sugar Islands, he said, "Bring me back 3 pounds of sugar if so much could be had at once." Now the average American eats between 130 and 150 pounds of sugar every single year per person, right? It's like 32 teaspoons per day. No nutrients for the brain. Comes in all kinds of sizes and shapes and drinks. Kids love to drink sugar, right? So this is 273 calories. So if you're a teenage boy, about 20 to 25% of your calories come from soda in America today. So, better, healthier alternatives. Water, coffee, dark chocolate. Right? Every morning I take raw cacao powder, pour it in some grass-fed milk, add some honey from our farm. That's hot chocolate, right? Why? Cacao is really good for my daughter's brain, I think. She wants something that's healthy and has some fat and some protein, or I want her to have those things. So that's hot cocoa in our house, as opposed to, a packet. I find it to be more economical, more fun, and I think much better for her. Just to round out our food, we talk to patients about legumes and pulses. Now, you'll see why when we talk about meat and eggs and dairy, but one thought is that we need more plant-based proteins, right? So plant protein is incomplete. They're not going to have every amino acid. You have to sort of mix plants to make that happen. But we get good amounts of protein, great fibers, a whole sort of set of phytonutrients. So most people think blueberries are like the top antioxidant-containing plant. It's actually the small red bean, surprisingly. What I like about that is people often say, yeah, these are expensive foods. It's like, not this one, $2.29 a pound in downtown Manhattan, organic. So you can get a lot. Try and eat a pound of dried beans. I mean, after you soak them, it takes like a week of food. So all these are great choices. Small red beans, lentils, garbanzos, lots and lots of beans. And again, something that patients often don't know what to do with beans, right? The beans are super easy. Make a lentil salad with a little red onion, a little feta cheese. Here's just, again, that same sort of nutrient density, right? A couple lentils, 230 calories, you get 90% of your folate, right? You get about a third of your iron. Same thing here with red beans, right? Good amounts of folate, 16 grams of protein, right? So again, really, really great thing to add to your salads, add to your foods. Nuts and seeds, so there's that mystery of nuts, right? Why do nuts protect us against low BDNF? That will be an emerging story, but nuts are great, and they're one of those things that have gotten pushed out of most people's diets as they've tried to eat low-fat, low-calorie. So instead we want people to eat high nutrient density. You're going to get really one of the only sources of lots and lots of vitamin E. You get manganese, which is like magnesium. Manganese sits at the center of superoxide dismutase, another one of these innate antioxidants that we make. And Brazil nuts, you get lots of selenium. Don't eat too many Brazil nuts because you get selenium toxicity. Here's that number, right? So this is 6 Brazil nuts, you get 774% of your selenium. That's why there are not a lot of those in the nut mix. But again, vitamin E, 1 ounce of almonds, again, more calories, but you get a tremendous number of healthy nutrients. These are walnuts, which are a great source of that short-chained omega-3 fat. Yes? So peanuts are a ground nut. I think peanuts are a healthy nut. There's some concern with sort of older peanuts or some peanut butters with aflatoxin. But peanuts are reasonably good. And I think peanut butter is one of those things that people don't think about that necessarily as a healthy food, but it's a ground-up nut. Like, it's reasonably good for you. So the mystery of nuts, as I said, and not just nuts, but seeds. Probably my favorite are these pumpkin seeds. I add them to almost everything because they've got a great dose of zinc, mainly, and a wonderful way to flavor food. We've got to end in all right, so I'm going to, where am I? All right, I just want to talk about grains because there's been this controversy, right? The book came out called Grain Brain, that said, the whole problem with our brains is wheat. And I'm not sure that that's where the evidence is. When we look at what has happened in America to food overall, right, this is the grain. We started eating more grains and more refined grains in the sort of early 80s. This is very depressing, I think. We've been telling people to eat more vegetables, right, for 4 decades now. That's why I wrote 50 Shades of Kale. I was like, saying eat more is not working. I say, this is a sexy vegetable. Maybe that'll get people to eat more. We'll see. The other thing is that we increased fats and oils, right? So now we're eating, again, this is all glucose, and this is just simple, mainly polyunsaturated fats. All to say, I don't think it's just the grains that have done it, and I like to say it's really a shame to blame human folly on a beautiful plant. Wheat's a very nice plant. When all the controversy came out with wheat, I'm a farm boy, as I said, so I went and grew some. It makes you really respect the plant when you see how many calories you can get out of an acre of land with wheat. The controversy comes from there are people who have very severe reactions to these proteins in wheat, and just the facts about it. So celiac, there are now actually several case reports of people with full-on schizophrenia who've gotten off wheat and recovered, right? Because people with celiac disease have an autoimmune disorder to these gliadin proteins. There's gluten sensitivity. Now, according to the popular press, everyone has this. Everyone does have some problems actually digesting gliadin, but gluten sensitivity probably is between 1 and 6% of the population. All that means is that 90% of people probably do fine with wheat. And it's also very hard to separate out. When people stop eating wheat, they stop eating white carbs, they stop eating processed foods, right? They start making a lot of healthier choices, and they have the placebo effect of changing their diet. Anytime we change someone's diet, they feel better, no matter what you do. Paleo, Atkins, stop eating wheat. This is also interesting for us as mental health clinicians. 23% of patients with schizophrenia have antibodies to gliadin. So there's something going on here. Now, when you have the reaction, what happens is the gliadin fragments cause a release of zonulin. Zonulin sort of opens up these tight gaps in your gut. So then your bloodstream sees your food. That's always a bad idea because then there's all kinds of inflammatory reactions. So lastly, spices and herbs. This is just, again, a huge medicine cabinet. Molecules from rosemary are in trials for dementia. Turmeric, the secret with turmeric is always have it with black pepper. Turmeric is not really absorbed that well unless you add black pepper. If you add black pepper, you increase absorption by 2,000%. So when I make like my eggs in the morning, I'll put in some kale, I'll put on a little curcumin or turmeric, and then I'll put some black pepper on there. And then again, all of these are, if you look at sort of traditional diets, like an Ayurvedic diet, right? They're just full of these. And these are incredibly concentrated with phytonutrients. And then fruits, fruits kind of get a bad rap in some ways, but I think fruits are great. Cacao is a fruit. Avocados are a fruit. Again, eat an apple. It's 11 grams of carbohydrate. It has one ingredient. You get lots of phytonutrients. You can carry it around in your backpack. A bag of organic apples this big, even at Whole Foods, costs $5. Right? A good, simple, easy, healthy, nutritious snack. This is what I think a good snack looks like. We've got some cacao nibs over grass-fed yogurt with some organic fruit on it. And then quickly, I just want to talk about meat. Now, why should we talk about meat? Right? Everyone just decides you shouldn't eat meat because meat's not good for you. Well, one, I would say that is not true. And two, we just eat too much meat. The average American eats 270 pounds per year, right? That's an incredible, incredible amount of meat. Now, one reason we can't do that anymore is our planet can't afford it. It's very energy intensive to make a steak. The reasons that we like meat, and oftentimes women crave meat, there's this very absorbable form of iron, heme iron. It is a complete protein. There's a good source of B12. There's this fat controversy, right, that saturated fat has caused heart disease. If you're worried about that, say look into the data very closely. But if you eat a grass-fed steak, as most people I have a picture here in a second, much lower in saturated fats and a much higher in things like vitamin E and carotenoids. Eggs, I think eggs are confusing these days because there are so many types of eggs, and eggs have a fair amount of cholesterol. But again, if you ignore cholesterol, right, which is sort of strange, it's odd that you can just eat 2 of these little puppies for 140 calories and eat more cholesterol than you're supposed to. And given that dietary cholesterol really does not have a big impact on health outcomes, like no impact on health outcomes, I think eggs are a great way to start the day. In particular, choline. This is the most recent essential nutrient. 1998, we made this an essential nutrient. It's like a B vitamin, or B-like vitamin. Good amounts of iodine, right beside seafood, really one of the only sources. Good amounts of B12, really one of the only foods that has both folate and B12. So again, and inexpensive. A dozen eggs, like $3 to $4 at the farmer's market. Those are my chickens. That's Gracie, Bach, and Lexi. I bought them at the 4-H fair. They came home. The next morning, there were 3 eggs sitting in the coop. It's like, this is easy. I'm a chicken farmer now. So again, 2 ingredients, right? Good breakfast, that's eggs and potatoes. Just quickly, the grass-fed versus the grain-fed, you just get a leaner cut when you go grass-fed. So some people don't like that because if you're used to steaks, we like that steak that dissolves in your mouth. That's why I encourage people to get a slow cooker. Think about a shank, think about stew meat, think about beef stew, think about really using the cooking to loosen up and moisten the meat. We like grass-fed beef because it comes from here as opposed to here. And if you've ever been out to a feedlot, boy, you know when you're there. You know about 3 miles before you get there because your eyes start to burn. This is not something that is sustainable, even though it's very, very efficient. And the other thing that's just interesting, grass-fed meat is not a great source of omega-3 fats. You get about 100 milligrams, but If you go to a feedlot, it sort of disappears. You get no omega-3 fats in grain-fed beef. But most people aren't eating this nice selection from my butcher. They're eating this new meat, right? So I was in Walmart in Indiana, and I love it. It says, gluten-free ham. Who put gluten in my ham? Right, so we're eating a lot of kind of meat-like substances. So the short answer, we'll do some questions now, is can you eat to build a better brain? I hope you see that there's a possibility you can by looking at data that examines dietary patterns and focusing on the concepts like nutrient density. Simple rules I tell patients: look for colors, don't fear fat, have fun with your food. I mean, I hate it when people stop having fun with food. Food's supposed to be what sustains us and nourishes us and makes us us. Don't be scared of fish. It looks like the data is telling us that whole foods and Mediterranean diet can be protective for depression, dementia, ADHD, right? So this is a very powerful data signal. And then we should learn from history. If it's not something that people in the past, our evolutionary ancestors would recognize as food, I think you should be suspicious. You can eat to build a better brain, I would argue, by counting brain nutrients, not calories, by getting rid of foods and packaged and highly processed foods that as colleague Mark Hyman said, eat the food that God made, not the food that man made, which I always like. Fix fats, which to me means focus on omega-3 fats and eating more of them. Eat lots of plants with those phytonutrients and move to complex carbs. And remember the rule of kale: nutrient density, culinary versatility, and local availability. So thank you. It's been really nice to be here, and these are some folks who helped me with my work. This is National Kale Day, where we have lots of recipes, and we love it when health centers get involved. These are a couple of my mentors, and this is how to get in touch with me, and I'm on all the various social media things. So thank you all. I think we have time for some questions. Yes, ma'am. So my philosophy is that when you have a special sort of specific diagnosis, I think it's very important to follow your healthcare provider's advice, because those people tend to know more about that condition than anyone else. I do think it's questionable. The issue with things like greens and the thyroid is that there's competition for iodine, and that's a problem for people in America because we don't eat a lot of iodine because it mainly comes from seafood. There's never been a trial that's ever shown that things like kale cause thyroid issues. So So I don't have a complete answer for you other than a lot of that it's the kind of soundbite that gets repeated. So there's just an article that came out about a week ago with a prominent nutritionist saying you should never eat raw kale. It's horrible for your thyroid and horrible for your gut, and that's just not true. It's an easy soundbite to repeat that doesn't have any evidence to it. So, yes, sir. So my thoughts are I'm not a cardiologist, so I think there are a lot of cardiologists are thrashing around. My understanding of the data, I was very surprised at how little data there was on dietary cholesterol and both risk, and then the numbers say that like 10% will change your LDL level by eating a lot of cholesterol, but lots of things will mess up your cholesterol profile, like eating sugar or eating lots of fructose. And so what I'm concerned about is where then there's certainly people who should be cautious around dietary cholesterol who have specific medical conditions, but I would say that when you see people move from things like eating a couple of eggs in the morning a few days a week to eating, lots of, a bagel, right, refined carbohydrates, that concerns me because I don't think that's a good choice. And I think it's also we've gotten ahead of ourselves. Think about all the theories of heart disease came about in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s for the most part, right? What did we do? In 1912, we added trans fats. Americans started smoking. From 1910 to 1950, we went from not smoking cigarettes in America to smoking 2,500 cigarettes per person per year, right? So it's hard for me to I get concerned when there's kind of like a one molecule theory, like, oh, it's all about the cholesterol. It's like, I know a lot of people who don't eat cholesterol and they have heart attacks. And I know a lot of people who do eat cholesterol and don't have heart attacks. So I think, again, it's an emerging data set where we also now do these fractionated cholesterol profiles where LDL, there are actually like 7 types of LDL, right? There's the light fluffy that doesn't have any problems with heart disease. There's this small dense. There are types of HDL that aren't protective. So I think it's an emerging story. What happens to most people is when they improve their dietary quality, eat more whole foods, their numbers get better and they lose weight. Yes? Yeah, so alkaline and acidity is a way that people look at diet where, and it's a concern that proponents of kind of eating no meat have, where the idea is, let me remember this idea exactly so I can get this right. The idea is that to buffer acids, you over time slowly decrease pH in a way that pulls calcium out of your bones. I'm not a big proponent of this because my feeling is, you drop all of your food into a acid bath, right, pH of 2, and it's hard for me to imagine that eating a little bit too much acid does much to you. So I haven't been very compelled by those sorts of arguments. I think about it a little bit like I think about the blood type diet, where there's a little bit of data, but given that most people don't know how many calories are in an egg, it's like there's a lot of low-lying fruit for me, literally, for us to do in terms of improving people's diet. And I think folks are very confused about nutrition. So when we start talking about alkalinity and acidity and lists of foods, I think it really confuses people and overall kind of isn't that sustainable. That's my thought. I think it follows up on what happened to all of us in community mental health, right, when the atypicals came out, that all of a sudden as psychiatrists, it's like, wow, now I'm checking labs, I'm checking your cholesterol, I'm doing all these different things. And we put in place systems to do that, right? So what I would hope, and my ideal in 5 to 10 years, if these ideas catch on, is that when we do an intake, we're going to ask about food. We're going to ask those simple questions like, do you have access to food, right? Tell me what you eat. We're going to get a basic profile of somebody's eating and have a sense of whether that's a way that they might want to intervene. And then I think it's about kind of having a set of providers who are excited about this, who have some knowledge, right? Actually, I don't know a lot about nutrition. It sounds like it because but I would say I know what most docs know, to be honest, which is some basic biochem and, some nutritional factoids. So I think it's getting sort of, I think the missing piece actually are cooks. I don't think we have a place where, there's a cooking group. So for lunch once a week, you get a group of patients together and they cook lunch together, right? And in that lunch are a set of lessons, right? How do you make a seafood meal for $4 a person? Well, I do that with a kale Caesar salad with lots of garlic and lots of lemon zest and some anchovies in there, so you get lots of omega-3 fats. So sharing that meal and I think being surprised by food happening within a mental health setting, I hope to see more of that. But I think it's it's engaging people who are interested, because I don't think you need a ton of nutritional knowledge. I still am of a belief that people, if you put a healthy and unhealthy meal in front of people, they know which is the healthy meal. Yes? Yeah, and Tom, I think the way is, I always say the next step is the best step. Like the reason I started asking all my patients about food is somewhere in the midst of pitching the happiness diet, my literary agent looked at me and said, "So do you eat the happiness diet?" I was like, Yeah, sure. I mean, like, I said, do your patients eat the happiness diet? And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm writing this book on nutrition, and I ask a little bit, but I don't know. So I just started asking everybody about what they eat. And what I found as a psychiatrist, I mean, all of you who deal with patients, it is like the richest material. Because people have all these memories around the dinner table and how they get food and how they care for themselves. And so I find the conversations about food just aren't happening in healthcare, right? In primary care as well. And that's where just have a conversation. Hey, I've been eating a lot of kale recently. How about you? Oh, yeah, I heard about that kale. Is it good for me? Is it not? How to eat it? So just have a conversation about food and lead with what excites you.
One more question. I just want to be responsive to your time.
I see two hands, Tom. Yes.
I and my son, we do have a community garden, and we do cooking classes and talk a portion of our clients. But then there's that other portion that we don't really get into it, and they use the food shelf a lot. And what do they get at the food shelf?
White carb.
Yes. So how do we help make an impact on that as well?
Well, and first of all, I love that you have a community garden. I think that's always wonderful because aside from the food, there are all these, I feel my best when I'm farming. Before I even eat the food, I'm just out there with my hands in the dirt. I think it's a tricky question. How do we, there are patients, we all know, who just don't want to engage, right? They're not going to engage with us around their mental health.
Well, they can't because they
Yeah, so that's where I just think it's about engagement, encouragement, and those transformational moments. Like I remember I was out on Randall's Island and we had a group of kids with autism come to one of the NYC Grow Gardens. And when the kids pulled the carrot out of the ground, because they had no idea where carrots came from, they were like, oh, wow, this is the coolest thing ever, right? So I think those kids are going to want to eat more carrots. So what I love about the garden is there is something that's very miraculous when you're involved with that, of seeing this tiny little seed makes like dozens of pounds of tomatoes. And that's always sort of been a very inspirational moment for me in the farm. So I think you find people coming on board on all, whether it's the wonder of the plant or whether it's how delicious the fresh tomato is. So I would say with people who don't engage, I just make sure when you sample your tomatoes this summer, say, hey, Tom, come on over here, have one of these tomatoes. We grew these. Didn't you help out plant these plants? Where it's just getting them a little engaged about the food and then adding a little message why it's healthy. And then with patients who are motivated, I always link it a little bit to, this. You should think about this as a medicine, right? And everybody wants to decrease their meds, and I'm always a little hesitant. I don't think for everybody we can swap out, Seroquel for salmon, but I think that better nourished people do better. And I think when people do better, they have fewer crises, they end up on fewer meds. There was one more question. I want to one more question. So I've been doing this in my practice, and then a very smart resident called me up from Toronto and said she had a lot of research time and wanted to do a project around food. So we're trying to create a manual for clinicians, which is how do we take kind of what I'm doing and what a lot of people do, which is having a conversation about food. How do we study if that has an effect or not? This is all great, but this is all theoretical. You didn't see one randomized controlled trial about food because there's never been one. So to really, I think, push the dial on this, we need to start showing differences in outcome. We need to show that we as mental health clinicians can change behavior. And so the idea is to distill as efficiently as possible. How do we get people to collect food as a vital sign? And then how do we give them some ideas on what to do to improve their diet in a structured way as part of regular mental health sessions? So our ideas, we're close to having a somewhat valid instrument, and then we're looking for places to help us pilot that and test it in terms of, do you like it? Does it work? Where does it fit? I'd be very interested in you guys in terms of, can you afford to, right? Because we're not getting reimbursed much for our mental health care. Talking about kale, I don't think we're getting reimbursed anything for that. So does it help, right? Who does it help with? These are all questions that we need a tool, at least a rough tool to start. And so the idea is to create that very simple, structured, sort of like a manualized psychotherapy of these are the questions we want you to ask. These are the types of answers that we think you should give. These are the types of foods we want patients to eat. And then in that packet will be sort of a sets of nutrients and sets of foods so the clinicians can feel they have the nutrition information you feel I have, which is just kind of very basic facts, right? What has lots and lots of iron in it. Well, now you have some ideas of some foods, right? And sort of I think about through my week, when I think about my eating, I think, oh, have I eaten any seafood? And when I say, like, no, I haven't, it's like, all right, that influences my next choice. I go get some mussels or some wild salmon, right? And I make sure and eat that brain nutrient, as opposed to thinking, oh, calorie counting is very easy. I have eaten the exact same number of calories every single week for the last 20 years of my life. I know that because I weigh the same as I did in college, right? I weigh exact same weight. So without even counting a calorie ever, I've had perfect caloric control. And I think part of that is I just don't eat fake food, so I don't give my brain bad data. I got to run. Thank you, everybody.